The air inside the vast, cold lecture hall at Fort Hamilton was always thick with the scent of old paper and stale coffee. This was the fortress of American military history, where dusty men in ill-fitting suits debated the geometry of past wars. But today, the room was focused on Captain Elena Vance, a historian whose quiet intensity and sharp intellect stood out, but whose youth often left her invisible. Elena stood before the Senior Command Review Board, her spine rigid, presenting the culmination of 2 years of doctoral-level work, a deep dive into the final. Desperate days of the Ruhr pocket in April 1945. This wasn't a standard briefing on troop movements. It was an attempt to capture the human heart of the collapse. She clicked the slide projector. A faded, grainy photo of muddy, exhausted German soldiers appeared, men who looked barely old enough to shave, let alone fight a war. The consensus history, Elena began, her voice steady and clear, focuses on the tactical defeat. But to understand the true impact of the surrender of 325,000 men, the largest mass surrender since the fall of Stalingrad, we have to look inside the pocket. We need to focus on the moment the fighting stopped, not just the moment the last shot was fired. She spoke simply of the starvation, the endless shell fire, and the absolute hopelessness that had crushed the spirit of these young soldiers long before the Americans arrived. She used language rooted in emotion, fear, despair, relief, grief. This, she knew, was her battlefield. The atmosphere in the room changed. General Wallace Maddox, a towering man of the old school whose uniform seemed tailored from granite, leaned forward at the head of the table. Maddox was Elena's superior and the gatekeeper for all published historical accounts from the base. He frowned, his face a mask of disapproval. When Elena finished, the silence was heavy. Maddox cleared his throat. "Thank you, Captain Vance. Excellent presentation of the facts." However, he paused, letting the word hang in the air like an accusation. "However, Captain, I find your language, frankly, detrimental to the work. Terms like existential dread and a desperate thirst for surrender are not military terms. They are sentimentalities. You spent 12 minutes discussing the feelings of the German adversary. We are discussing the greatest victory of the Allied Western Front. We are not writing poetry, Captain. We are writing history." A few senior colonels chuckled politely. Elena felt the insult, the dismissive wave of his hand. The mocking tone that suggested her emotional insight was a feminine weakness, not a historical strength. "General," Elena said, refusing to back down, "to separate the history of war from the emotions of the men who fight it is to render it meaningless. We have to understand why 500,000 men simply dropped their rifles. It wasn't just logistics. It was a psychological break." Maddox tapped his pen sharply on the table. "Your analysis is too soft, Captain. Too much heart. Not enough fire. You need to focus on the strategy, the movement, the pure cold fact of the collapse. Remove the sentiment. Bring this back to me rewritten with professional distance, or it will not be published under the authority of this institution." The meeting was dismissed. Elena stood alone, the rejection stinging, but not breaking her. Maddox had insulted her work, yes, but he had underestimated her resolve. She hadn't come this far to be dismissed by a man who treated history like a simple ledger sheet. She knew the real untold story of the Ruhr pocket lay not in tactical maps, but in the quiet, agonizing moments of those men realizing the war was over. And she would find the proof to silence General Maddox forever. Elena left the suffocating formality of Fort Hamilton and drove east, away from the military complex and toward the quiet, suburban Virginia town where her family lived. The drive was a necessary release, allowing the fury of General Maddox's dismissal to cool into cold, hard determination. Maddox had called her soft. He demanded pure, cold fact, but Elena's passion was born from fact, facts that had been carefully silenced over the years. Her research had always been driven by something deeper, a familial connection to the ghosts of 1945. Her grandfather, Private First Class John Jack Riley, had been a medic with the U.S. 83rd Infantry Division, one of the units that crashed through the final German defenses into the Ruhr pocket. He had never spoken of it, not once. But when he passed away 10 years ago, he left Elena a locked, heavy wooden footlocker that held his wartime secrets. She found the locker exactly where it always was, tucked away in the dusty attic corner of her grandmother's house. The attic was dim, smelling of cedar and forgotten time. He said you were the only one smart enough to look past the brass. "Ellie?" her grandmother had said at the time, handing her a small, tarnished silver key. Elena twisted the key. The heavy lid groaned open, and the scent of aged canvas and mildewed paper filled the air. Inside were the expected artifacts: a worn uniform, a tattered Bible, a bronze star. But under the neatly folded blanket, she found the true treasure: a stack of letters tied with twine, and a small, olive-drab notebook bound in stiff leather. The letters were Grandfather Jack's weekly correspondence home, filled with the usual soldier talk. "Weather's awful, food is terrible, don't worry about me." They were cheerful, surface-level lies designed to protect the people he loved. But the notebook was different. It was his daily journal, kept in tiny, dense handwriting. Jack hadn't just chronicled American movements. He had chronicled the moments between the fighting, the interactions with the broken enemy, the raw humanity of it all. Elena carefully opened it to the entries dated April 14th through 17th, 1945, the final chaotic days inside the pocket, April 16th, 1945. The shelling stopped before dawn. Total silence. Then the crying started. Not screaming, just quiet, ragged crying. "We took a prisoner, maybe 16 years old. He didn't have a weapon, just a picture of a farmhouse and a tin of stale biscuits. He wasn't defiant. He wasn't even scared. He was just empty," said "Kein Krieg mehr" over and over. "No more war," Elena gasped softly. Maddox had demanded cold facts. This was a cold fact, but it was dripping with feeling. It was an eyewitness account of the psychological defeat she had tried to describe, but the final pages held the ultimate prize. Tucked inside the last entry, written on a thin, brittle piece of German paper, was a folded letter. It wasn't from her grandfather. It was a note, written in German, from a soldier named Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, signed and dated April 17th, 1945. At the very moment of his surrender, Klaus had apparently given it to Jack to somehow mail after the war, a final note to a family he assumed he'd never see again. The American medic had kept it hidden for 50 years. Elena pulled out her phone and snapped a quick, high-resolution photo of the letter. This wasn't just an anecdote. It was a primary source, proof of the desperate final hours, written by the enemy and validated by the Allied medic who saved it. This was the fire she needed. This was the missing piece to redeem her work. She had the factual evidence that proved Maddox was wrong. With Klaus Richter's letter and her grandfather's journal now scanned and cross-referenced, Elena went back to her draft. This time she wasn't just presenting history. She was delivering an experience. She wove the personal accounts into the larger tactical framework, letting the emotion serve the facts, not detract from them. Elena's voice, narrating the content of her new draft: the Ruhr pocket, a 6,000-square-mile cage of mud, broken concrete and shattered hope, was the largest entrapment of the war. But the real story isn't the map, it's the sound. By mid-April 1945, the only sound was the constant grinding artillery and the internal sound of a nation's spirit snapping. Imagine being Klaus Richter, a 17-year-old soldier, one of hundreds of thousands trapped, shivering, starving. His diary, found by an American medic, paints a picture of hell far more visceral than any official report. Narrator voice, simple and engaging. The journal entries Elena had uncovered showed that, in those final hours, the German soldiers weren't plotting a heroic last stand. They were calculating the quickest way to end the suffering without being killed by their own retreating SS or by desperate Allied shelling. They were not fanatic Nazis. They were boys who wanted to go home. Klaus Richter's final letter, translated by Elena, was the centerpiece. It was addressed to his younger sister, Sophie, and it offered a heartbreaking glimpse into the realization that the war was, for him, completely and utterly over. Elena's voice, reading the letter's content. "My dear Sophie, if you ever read this, it means the Americans were kind. They took our names, but they didn't take our hope. It is Tuesday, April 17th. Yesterday, we received the order to fight to the last man. But there is nothing left to fight with, and nothing left to fight for. The officers are gone. The city is dust. I sat by a ruined church, and I saw a man, an old man, a Volkssturm, drop his rifle into the mud and simply walk away toward the American lines with his hands up. No shouting, no glory, just silence. It was then, Sophie, that I knew. I knew the men inside the pocket, 500,000 of us. We weren't defeated by a strategy. We were defeated by the truth. Narrator voice, simple and engaging. Elena finished the new draft. It was raw, powerful, and historically undeniable. The journal and the letter offered the proof General Maddox had demanded, a fact-based look at the psychological reality of surrender. When she submitted the rewritten analysis, she expected resistance, but not what came next. General Maddox called her into his office the following afternoon, his eyes narrowed, an unnerving silence hanging between them. He held the printed manuscript in his hand. "Captain Vance," he said, his tone dangerously smooth, "the inclusion of the medic's testimony is compelling. The document is vastly improved." Elena allowed herself a small surge of triumph. "However," Maddox continued, his face tightening, "the German letter, the one signed Klaus Richter, that must be redacted. It has no place in an official historical account. It's too sentimental. It shows the enemy not as a military force, but as victims. This is propaganda, not scholarship." Elena felt a cold dread. He hadn't dismissed it. He was trying to erase the very core of her discovery. He was trying to sanitize the truth. "General, it's a primary source. It validates my entire thesis on the psychological collapse of the pocket. To redact it is to compromise the integrity of the research." Maddox stood up, looming over his desk. "Your integrity, Captain, or your future? You will rewrite this. You will use only the facts of the medic's diary, the American soldier, and you will remove all trace of this German sentimentality. Failure to comply will result in a formal reprimand and termination of your residency here. You are ordered to comply." This wasn't an academic disagreement. It was a military command. Elena saw the betrayal in his eyes. He didn't just disagree with her. He was actively trying to destroy the truth she had worked so hard to uncover. The general's order hung heavy in the air, a threat masquerading as a command. Elena walked out of Maddox's office and back to her cubicle, her mind racing. This was not about historical accuracy anymore. It was about power, control, and the preservation of a stiff, cold narrative that General Maddox felt safe in. He was afraid of the human truth because it complicated his own hard and fast views on war. Elena spent the next 3 days in a silent, desperate battle, revising her manuscript repeatedly, trying to find a loophole, a way to keep Klaus Richter's letter without directly defying her superior. She tried burying it in a footnote, then minimizing it to a single sentence. But every edit felt like a lie. The whole point of her work was that the emotional reality was the historical fact of the surrender. She realized what Maddox was doing. He was demanding she commit professional suicide by sanitizing her most important discovery. He wanted to break her spirit, the very strength he had mocked as softness. On the 4th day, Elena made her decision. She would not comply. Instead of rewriting the document, she took 3 days of personal leave. She knew it was a career risk, a move that could end her time in the service. But she couldn't allow the truth her grandfather had protected for 50 years to be buried by a general obsessed with rigid, bloodless facts. That night, she called her old professor from Georgetown University, Dr. Alistair Hayes, a renowned military historian who had been following her research peripherally. He ordered me to redact the primary source. "Dr. Hayes, he called it propaganda," Elena explained. Her voice low and tight with controlled emotion. Hayes was silent for a long moment. "Maddox, yes, he has always preferred the clean line over the messy truth. Elena, you have the proof. You have the journal and the letter. If you redact it now, you bury it forever. Your integrity is worth more than his approval." Hayes then suggested a bold, risky plan. The annual Military History Summit was taking place in Baltimore in 2 days. It was a massive, prestigious gathering of historians, journalists, and retired flag officers. including many who had served with Maddox earlier in their careers. "Submit an abstract immediately," Hayes urged. "Use the title of your original research. I'll make a few calls. You're not presenting for the Army. You're presenting as a scholar. If the summit accepts your presentation, it puts you in front of the world's most respected military thinkers. Maddox can't touch you on neutral ground." Elena knew the move was insubordination. It was a direct, calculated risk that could lead to her being dishonorably discharged. But the thought of Klaus Richter's letter, that tiny piece of truth her grandfather had guarded, being tossed into the archival dumpster was unbearable. She immediately submitted her abstract, using a modified title that promised a controversial, human-centered analysis of the Ruhr pocket's collapse. She spent the next 36 hours creating the most powerful presentation of her career, meticulously stitching together maps, combat reports, her grandfather's observations, and crucially, Klaus Richter's final, desperate note to his sister. She was going to present the full, unvarnished story, and she would stand by the result, whatever the cost. Elena's abstract was accepted, an immediate sign that Dr. Hayes's connections had worked. 2 days later, she stood in a large, crowded ballroom in Baltimore, the atmosphere radically different from the cold scrutiny of Fort Hamilton. This audience was engaged, hungry for new insights, and composed of the people whose opinions truly mattered in her field. General Maddox had, predictably, denied her request for official travel and funding. Elena arrived in civilian clothes, a sharp, professional black suit, spending her own savings to book a room and cover the conference fees. This was her sacrifice. She was presenting without the Army's sanction, laying her entire career on the line for a historical truth. She stepped up to the podium. In the front row, she saw Dr. Hayes, smiling encouragingly. In the back, she was startled to see the formidable figure of General Maddox himself, who had clearly driven up to watch her potential failure. His jaw was tight, his arms crossed. He had come to witness her professional execution. Elena took a deep breath. She started the presentation with the hard facts Maddox preferred, the tactical encirclement, the lack of air support. But then she pivoted. "History doesn't happen on paper, it happens inside the mind of the soldier," she announced, her voice resonating across the hushed room. She showed a slide of a simple German pocket watch, broken and frozen at 3:15 p.m., April 17, 1945, the moment of surrender. Then she shared her grandfather's journal entries, reading the simple observational prose of an American medic witnessing the utter human breakdown of the enemy. She described the boys, no longer soldiers but shivering ghosts, dropping there, weapons not in defiance but in profound, exhausted relief. Finally, she displayed a high-resolution image of Klaus Richter's letter on the main screen, translated line by line next to the original German text. She read the closing passage again, the moment Klaus saw an old man simply drop his gun and walk away, defeated by truth, not strategy. Her voice caught slightly on the final line, not from sentimentality, but from the weight of the moment. She was presenting a narrative of war that acknowledged the humanity of all parties, and she was doing it in defiance of the established, authoritative military culture. When she finished, there was a beat of absolute silence. Then, the applause began. It wasn't the polite clapping of the review board. It was a wave of genuine, heartfelt appreciation that built into a standing ovation. Historians, young and old, military and civilian, rose to their feet. In the back, General Maddox remained seated, a cold, fixed expression on his face. During the Q&A, a highly decorated elderly man, the retired chief historian of the National Archives, stood up. "Captain Vance," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "that letter is one of the single most compelling primary sources I have seen regarding the psychological end of the Wehrmacht. It changes the way we understand that surrender. You, Captain, have done a service not just to history but to humanity." Elena's heart swelled. She had earned the respect of her peers, but the cost was still unknown. As the crowd surged forward to congratulate her, General Maddox rose from his seat and strode toward the exit. Elena knew he was planning her professional downfall. She had won the battle for the truth, but the war for her career was far from over. What she didn't know was that the most powerful card in her hand had yet to be played. The moment the presentation ended, Elena was on her phone, fielding calls of praise and support. The story of her defiance and the power of her sources was already spreading like wildfire across the historical community. But she hadn't forgotten the grim figure of General Maddox stalking out of the room. She knew a formal, punishing letter was waiting for her back at Fort Hamilton. As she packed up her materials, Dr. Hayes rushed over, holding a newspaper clipping. "Elena, look at this. Maddox is already trying to discredit the source, saying the German letter is unverified and potentially a forgery." "I expected that," Elena said calmly. "It's why I brought the ultimate proof." She pulled out the final aged piece of paper, Klaus Richter's handwritten letter, and an envelope containing photocopies of her grandfather's medical discharge papers. She looked at the general's rapidly receding figure in the hallway. This was the moment for the twist, the truth she had to expose not just for justice, but for her career. "Dr. Hayes, I need you to confirm one family detail for me," Elena whispered. "General Maddox's full name is Wallace Klaus Maddox, and his father, who passed away in the early 2000s, was also named Wallace, but went by his middle name, Klaus." Hayes's eyes widened in sudden, horrifying comprehension. He nodded slowly. Elena smiled, a cold, resolute look of strength replacing her earlier emotional tension. She quickly pursued General Maddox into the quiet administrative area of the hotel lobby. "General Maddox!" she called out. He stopped, turning slowly. His face was a mask of cold fury. "You committed gross insubordination, Captain. I look forward to signing the paperwork that ends your brief, sentimental career." Elena walked up to him, stopping inches away. She didn't shout. Her voice was dangerously low, optimized for the highest impact. "Before you sign that paperwork, General," she said, "you should read the primary source again." She held out the original folded letter, careful not to let him touch it. He glared at it, dismissing it instantly. "Propaganda, Captain. A pathetic attempt to romanticize failure." "It's not romantic, General," Elena corrected gently. "It's the final note written by your father, Wallace Klaus Maddox, Sr., born 1928, drafted 1944, captured Ruhr Pocket 1945. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter was his service name." Maddox froze, the blood draining from his face. His carefully constructed mask shattered. He stared at the letter, his eyes frantically reading. The familiar signature, the German words he hadn't seen since childhood. "My father. He always told me he fought to the end," Maddox stammered, his rigid posture suddenly trembling. "He always said the men who surrendered were cowards." "He had to say that to survive, General," Elena said, her voice now filled with a quiet, devastating compassion. "He had to create a strong, clean lie for the son he wanted to be proud of. But his truth, the real emotional agony of surrender, is right here. He gave this letter to my grandfather, an American medic, to make sure his sister knew he hadn't forgotten them. He protected the human truth, and my grandfather protected it for him." Elena then delivered the final decisive blow. "You mocked the research as too soft, General. You ordered me to bury the letter. You were ordering me to bury your own father's final honest testimony. You were fighting your father's ghost, not my research." Maddox stood there, utterly broken, the clean line of his uniform suddenly seeming flimsy. The exposure was complete. Within a week, General Maddox resigned, citing personal family matters. Elena's research, including Klaus Richter's letter, was published with full institutional backing and became a cornerstone text in post-war military psychology. Captain Elena Vance, the historian who had been dismissed as soft, was formally commended for her courage, her intellectual honesty, and her profound service to history. She had not sought revenge, but in exposing the truth, she achieved a justice far more powerful. She earned her respect and redeemed the quiet sacrifice of two soldiers, one American, one German, who believed that the truest history lies in the heart of the men who lived it.